Hey, welcome to Psychology with Mr. Shanahan. It's Chapter 3. Today we're going to talk about biology and behavior. The first thing we want to talk about is this guy named Phineas Cage. He's an important figure in psychological history. Phineas Cage was injured in a railroad accident in 1848. He suffered a brain injury that changed his personality. The accident and the aftermath, Gage was struck in the head by an iron bar. The bar ran through Gage's brain and out the top of his head. Gage recovered from the physical effects of the wound, but his personality seems to have been altered as a result. After Gage's death, his family donated his skull to a museum. Studies showed that the rod severely damaged an area in the brain related to personality. Other studies found similar changes after the injuries to the same part of the brain. So what we want to look at is, think about is how did Phineas Cage's personality change after his brain injury, and what are some of the possible circumstances in which individuals experience brain trauma? The nervous system functions as a communication system for the body. Messages are transmitted by neurons to the axons and dendrites. The nervous system is made up of the central nervous system, the system of peripheral nervous system, which transmits messages between the central nervous system and all parts of the body. So this is section 1, and the main idea of section 1 is the nervous system contains billions of cells called neurons. Neurons communicate with one another through the central and peripheral nervous systems. So what you'll want to ask yourself during this time is, what are the neurons, how do they work, and how do neurotransmitters work as chemical messengers? What does the central nervous system control, and how does peripheral nervous system structure? So as you're listening, you should be able to answer these questions. The nervous system has two parts. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of nerve cells that send messages between the central nervous system and other parts of the body. Nerve cells are called neurons. Components of the neuron. The cell body produces energy that fuels neurons' activity. Dendrites receive information from other neurons and pass the message through the cell body, and the axon transmits the information away from the cell body. Components of the neuron. The myelin is a white fatty substance that covers the axon, insulating and protecting the myelin sheath, and helps to speed up the work of the neurons. The axon terminals branch out at the end of the axon. The communication process of the neurons. Messages are sent from the axon terminals to one neuron to the dendrites of another neuron. In other words, this process to happen, the message must cross a synapse. A synapse is a junction between the axon terminals of one neuron and dendrites of another. Messages travel in one direction, enter the dendrites. They travel through the body, the cell body and axon to the axon terminals, and across the synapses to the dendrites of other neurons. So as you can see, here the dendrites receive the messages. They're given energy by the nucleus in the cell body, and you have your action potential shoots the message down through the axon, which is protected by the myelin sheath, and they come to the axon terminals, just like in the train station where you go to the terminal, the transfer stations, that kind of thing. And the synapse would be the switching point where you have to jump onto the train, and you go to the dendrites of the next one, the nucleus, down through the axon, protected by the fatty substance of the myelin sheath, and back through the axon terminals. Here in the axon terminals, you have the neurotransmitters, and they are activated by the nerve impulse in the neurotransmitters will jump across to the dendrite, signaling how the message that must continue on. Neurons send messages across the synapse through the release of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that are stored in sacs in the axon terminals. A neuron fires or sends the messages by releasing neurotransmitters. The message is converted into an electrical impulse that travels through the neuron. The message is transmitted to the next neuron by other neurotransmitters until the message arrives at its destination. There are several kinds of neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine, for instance, is involved in the control of muscle and in learning and in memory. Acetylcholine is oftentimes what people are lacking when they develop Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine is involved primarily in motor behavior and can also often be related to those that end up with Parkinson's. So here you see how the nervous system is structured. The nervous system is divided into two major portions: the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the system that branches off from the central nervous system. Of this, it contains two parts: the autonomic system, which is all the involuntary stuff that you have going on, your digestion system, your lungs, your heart, all that kind of stuff. The somatic system is your voluntary muscles and sense organs, the arms and legs and things like that. Then here in the autonomic system, as you can see, it's much more complex. You have the parasympathetic system, which calms the body after an emergency. In the sympathetic system that prepares the body for action. So this is your fight or flight mechanism being activated, where the sympathetic system will, slow your digestion, increase your heart rate, give you a burst of adrenaline, things like that to help you respond to an emergency. And then the parasympathetic system is what helps your body recover afterwards. The central nervous system consists of the neurons of the spinal cord and the brain. The spinal cord is a column of nerves that is about as thick as a thumb that extends the brain down the back. The spinal cord transmits messages between the brain, the muscles, the glands, and the body. The spinal cord sends messages to specific muscles. The spinal cord is involved in spinal reflexes. So as you can see, here's your brain and your spinal cord. This is your central nervous system. And off of that, you see the other parts of the nervous system coming off of that. And that is part of your peripheral nervous system. So let's talk about the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system transmits sensory messages to the central nervous system. It carries messages from the voluntary muscles and sense organs, and is activated by touch, pain, changes in temperature, and changes in body temperature. And so this autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, which is, as we saw in the other diagram, is the autonomic nervous system, is far more complex. It regulates the body's vital functions. It makes sure that your heartbeat and breathing continue, that your digestion works, and that your blood pressure. It has two divisions, as we previously mentioned: the sympathetic nervous system, which reacts to stress, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which restores peace to the body's systems. The brain is composed of three major sections: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The cerebral cortex is the part of the brain that controls thinking, memory, language, emotions, complex motor function, perception, and much more. The main idea for this section, section 2, the human brain has many parts that work together to coordinate the body. The movement create thought and emotions and shape behaviors. So what are some of the early beliefs about the brain? What are the parts of the brain and how do they function? How is the cerebral cortex divided? And which methods do scientists use to study the brain? In ancient times, people did not attribute human physiological processes such as thinking to the workings of the brain. Instead, people widely believed that the body was inhabited by souls or demons. Ancient Egyptians believed that the person dwelled within the skull, and ancient Egyptians believed that a little person dwelled within the skull and regulated your behavior. So it's sort of like in the movies where they have somebody's operating a little robot behind your eyes. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, on the other hand, thought that the soul resided in the heart. Today we recognize that the mind or consciousness dwells within the brain. The hindbrain, or the medulla, is involved in the heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing. The pons regulates body movement, attention, sleep, and alertness. The cerebellum is involved in the balance and coordination. The midbrain, or areas within the midbrain, are involved in vision and hearing. It contains the reticular activating system, which is important for our attention, sleep, arousal, and alertness. The thalamus serves as a relay station for the sensory stimulation. The hypothalamus is vital to regulation of body temperature, the storage of nutrients, and the various aspects of motivation and emotion. It is also involved in hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, caring for offspring, and aggression. The limbic system is involved in learning and memory, emotion, hunger, sex, and aggression. The cerebrum makes up 70% of the brain's weight and is where most of your conscious intellectual activities takes place. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain. It is the part that thinks and also deals with memory, language, emotions, complex motor skills, perception, and more. So how do the functions of the midbrain and the forebrain differ? The midbrain is involved with vision and hearing. The forebrain is complex thinking processes, the thalamus, hypothalamus, and limbic system in the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex has the left side and the right side. Each side is called a hemisphere. The corpus callosum is a structure that connects the two hemispheres. The information received by one side of the brain body is transmitted to the opposite hemisphere of the brain. So your right hemisphere receives messages from the left side of your body, and your left hemisphere receives messages from the right side of the body. Each hemisphere is divided into 4 parts. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Neurons create and send more messages than all phones in the entire world. Combined, the neurons create enough electricity to power a 10-watt light bulb. Sensory neurons send information to the brain at the speed of more than 150 miles per hour. Motor neurons relay information at a speed of more than 200 miles per hour. The adult human brain weighs about 3 pounds, about the same as your textbook, and it contains about 100 billion neurons. If the cerebral cortex was unfolded, it would cover a typical classroom desk. The surface area of the cerebral cortex is large enough to hold more than 10 billion neurons. The average human brain is 75% water, and during the first month of life, the number of synapses in an infant's brain increase 50 trillion to 1 quadrillion times. The occipital lobe is the primary visual area of the cerebral cortex. The temporal lobe is the hearing or auditory area of the cerebral cortex. Messages received from the skin's sensory receptors are projected to the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe. These sensations include warmth, cold, touch, and pain. The association areas of the cerebral cortex shape information into something meaningful. The association areas in the frontal lobes function as the brain's executive center. Association areas provide the core of the working memory. The frontal region of the brain thus retrieves visual, auditory, and other kinds of memories. Other association areas make possible the psychological functions of language. Language abilities. For nearly all right-handed people, language functions are based in the left hemisphere. Language functions are based in the left hemisphere of about 2 out of 3 left-handed people. Wernicke's area connects sounds and sights, and when this area is damaged, people find it difficult to understand speech. Broca's area, on the other hand, is involved in speech, and when this area is damaged, people speak slowly and use simple sentences and have difficulty speaking. The left hemisphere is usually more involved in logic, problem solving, and mathematical computation. The right hemisphere is more concerned with the imagination, art, feelings, and spatial relations. Split brain operations have taught psychologists much of what they are known about left and right hemisphere functioning. Accidents. Researchers are able to learn about how the brain is related to psychological function through the study of the brain damage due to accidents, as in the example of Phineas Cage. Lesions are when scientists can study the brain by cutting or removing or destroying parts of it. The method is used on laboratory animals. Lesions are sometimes studied in humans in the event of like a cancer or something like that, or when we have accidents. Electrical stimulation has been discovered to activate parts of the brain. Electrical stimulation of the brain has shown specific areas are associated with specific type of sensations. It's not reliable. It is not a reliable research tool, however. The electroencephalogram, or the EEG, is the device that records electrical activity of the brain, and the EEG's readings can help diagnose certain psychological disorders to help locate tumors. Brain imaging can provide information. Brain damage, cancers, difficult surgeries. There are different types of brain imaging, and they include what's called a CAT scan, an MRI scan, a PET scan, and an fMRI scan. Accidents that cause brain injuries provide researchers with opportunities for learning about how different parts of the brain function. Lesions, by creating a lesion or deliberately destroying part of an animal's brain, researchers can track how that damage affects certain behaviors. Electrical stimulation. By electrically stimulating the brain, researchers have been able to determine which areas of the brain respond to visual, auditory, or sensory sensations. The electroencephalogram, the electrical brain wave activity, is transmitted by electrodes, and it enables researchers to diagnose certain disorders. Brain imaging scans such as the MRI, the CAT scan, the PET scan, and the fMRI allow researchers to create images of the brain and record certain brain functions such as the ability to see a photograph. Section 3, the endocrine system. The endocrine system secretes hormones that stimulate growth in many kinds of reactions such as activity levels and moods. The major endocrine glands such as the pituitary, the thyroid, and the adrenals, the testes, and the ovaries. The endocrine system consists of glands that secrete substances called as hormones. The pituitary gland is the king of the endocrine system. It lies just below the hypothalamus in the middle of the brain, and it secretes hormones that include human growth hormone, prolactin, and oxytocin. Some pituitary hormones stimulate other endocrine glands such as the adrenals, the thyroid, and the ovaries or testes. The thyroid gland produces the hormone thyroxine. Thyroxine affects the body's metabolism. Too little thyroxine can cause hypothyroidism and cretinism. Too much thyroxine can cause hyperthyroidism. The adrenal glands are located above the kidneys. The outer layer or cortex secretes corticosteroids. Corticosteroids increase resistance to stress and promote musical development and make the liver release stored sugar to provide energy during emergencies. The adrenal glands produce the adrenal and non-adrenal. So here you see the endocrine system. It secretes hormones that stimulate various body functions. The pituitary gland secretes hormones including human growth hormone. The thyroid gland produces thyroxine, which controls the body's metabolism. The adrenal glands secrete corticosteroids, adrenaline, and non-adrenaline, which help the body deal with stress in your fight or flight systems. Here in the testes, for males, it's the male sex hormone that establishes development in primarily secondary sex characteristics and produces trace amounts of estrogen and progesterone. However, in males, they tend to have vastly more than females, and very little estrogen is produced. On the other hand, with females, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone in the female sex hormone and establish the development of their primary sex characteristics, secondary sex characteristics, and produce trace and secondary sex characteristics, and they produce trace amounts of testosterone. So, but it's very small amount in comparison to the male. Likewise, the estrogen is very small for males in comparison to the female. Ovaries and testes. In females, testes in the ovaries in females and testes in males produce hormones that influence sexual development and function. Both glands produce estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Estrogen and progesterone are female sex hormones that regulate the menstrual cycle. Estrogen has a psychological as well as a biological effects. Low levels of estrogen and progesterone are found in males. Testosterone is the primary male sex hormone. It aids the growth of muscle and bone. It aids development of primary and secondary sex characteristics. Small amounts are found in females. Teens anabolic steroid use. The use of anabolic steroids among teenagers has decreased over the last 10 years. However, the teens who continue to use steroids do not always know what can happen as a result. Here are some of the effects of the use of anabolic steroids on the bodies of teenagers. For the male, it may cause breast development, risk hair loss, and male pattern baldness. Not to mention, it reduces the size of the testes. Female risks male type facial hair growth and male pattern baldness. They may also experience a deepening of the voice. in both sexes may have stunted growth or worsening acne and may develop liver tumors or abnormalities that affect the heart. And they may even exhibit aggressive behavior, mood swings. And you may have heard the term roid rage, which is associated with steroid use. Section 4. Our heredity or genetic background. Heredity plays a key role in the development of individuals. Heredity is transmitted through genes which are found in chromosomes. Kinship studies allow researchers to determine the influence of heredity and environment on individuals. So the main idea of this section is heredity is a transmission of characteristics from parents to offspring, both heredity and the environment and individuals' personal traits. So what you should be taking your notes on are what are the roles of genes and chromosomes in heredity? What are the main points of the nature versus nurture issue? And what are kinship studies? Heredity is the transmission of characteristics from parents to offspring. Psychologists study heredity to understand people's behavior. Genes are the building blocks of heredity. Genes are found in thread-like structures called chromosomes. Genes are composed of DNA. Most normal human cells have 46 pairs of chromosomes, divided into 23 pairs. In each pair, one chromosome is from the father and one is from the mother. The 23rd pair determines gender. When a child is born without all 46 chromosomes, physical behavioral disorders may result. The debate over the role of biology in determining who we are as people is called the nature-nurture issue. Nature refers to what people inherit. Nurture refers to the environmental factors. Nature's supporters argue that biological makeup of primarily determines people's traits and personality. Nurture supporters argue that the environment and everyday experiences determine how we behave and think. Both views are extreme. Most psychologists think that both nature and nurture determine our psychological traits. The role of heredity is still a controversial topic. And as you recall, in our opening chapter, we talked about how this was the big debate topic of psychology. So the discussion among researchers and psychologists about nature versus nurture has always been spirited. Although a few are completely on one side or the other, researchers have a tendency to favor one view over the other. The three experts here present their thoughts on the influence of nature and nurture with regard to parenting. Which of the opinions come closest to your point of view? Steven Pinker, Harvard professor and author of The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, believes that many parenting studies measure the correlation between parenting practices and the children's outcomes and conclude that parenting made the difference. However, it poses a question. How do we explain this very large component of personality that's not genetic, but that just surely doesn't come from growing up in a particular home? Author Judith Harris of The Nature Assumption states that it's the assumption that makes what children turn out the way they do aside from their genes. The environment part of the child development is the experiences they have with their parents. It's really in the second half of the 20th century that the idea of parental importance has become so popular and, in my view, exaggerated. Finally, we have Stanley Greenspan, who's a medical doctor and a child psychiatrist. He believes that nature-nurture work more as a dance, like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Once the dance starts, it's how they interact together. The potential is only defined by the gene interaction with the environment. And it may be that the environment sets the constraints just as much as the genes do. So which do you believe? Kinship studies focus on the roles that heredity and environment play in determining a trait. Kinship refers to the degree to which people are related. Twin studies of the identical and fraternal twins provide a way to learn about relative influence of nature and nurture. Adoptee studies. Psychologists also study children who have been adopted to look for relative similarities between children and their adoptive biological families. Twins reared apart. One of the most useful types of kinship studies focus on twins who have been reared apart. A lack of common experiences make it more likely that the similarities attributable to the genetic factors. And these studies are most famously been reported in what is called the Minnesota Twin Study, done by the University of Minnesota. Current research in psychology that the Genographic Project. Have you ever wondered where your ancestors came from? Some families can trace their history back several centuries, but where were your ancestors 1,000 or even 10,000 years ago? A remarkable program called the Genographic Project aims to map the migratory history of all humankind. What can it tell us about what we've all inherited from our ancestors? The Genographic Project analyzes the DNA contributed by people around the world. The project aims to find out how people migrated and populated the world. Another goal is to learn why they look so different from each other. The ultimate goal of the project is to uncover a web of migration stories that will explain how humans populated the world and to show how closely the human family is related. The project relies on DNA contributions from hundreds of thousands of people. So why would the results of this study be of interest to psychologists? It's a question we must ask ourselves and to consider. And then how do you think you would react if you found out that your ancestors came from a place much different from where you originally believed? So, to conclude this chapter, you could build a human brain if you'd like to do a lab. What are the major parts of the brain and how do they work? So you'll work with a partner to build a three-dimensional model of the human brain. Review the chapter, conduct additional research, gather the materials to create your model. Work with your partner to create two diagrams of the brain. Make one diagram of the major lobes of the brain and make one diagram of the middle and lower brain structures. Attach each diagram to one side of a coat hanger. Make an illustration or select an image or object to represent the function of the brain. Attach the image to the mobile. You should have 14 items, drawings, or objects hanging from your mobile. Attach each item, drawing, and object to the mobile with a string. The final challenge, mind over matter. Work with your partner to answer the questions in your textbook. Use your mobile to discuss what you've learned from this lab. This concludes Chapter 3, the Biology and Behavior. I hope you found this of interest and that We enjoy speaking with you again next time. This concludes Chapter 3, Psychology, Biology, and Behavior with Mr. Shanahan.